now. We're probably going to get started around 2:03, 2:04. While you're waiting, if you don't already have a pen and paper handy, grab something to write with and something to write on. We're going to have some interactive elements later on in today's sessions. So have a pen and paper handy. And if you're just dialing in now, you'll see there's a chat bar on the right-hand side of the screen if you're dialed into the webinar on Zoom. Tell us where you're dialing in from, and also any brainstorm challenges that you're facing right now. Myself and the rest of the ImageThink team, we're all dialed in from, well, most of us are dialed in from Brooklyn. Sam is in Pennsylvania. I'm joined by my colleagues, Sam Horvath, Director of Marketing, Miles Mosley, Director of Business Development, Ariel Rothenberg. You can't see her right now, but you can see the graphic recording that she's going to be developing on the shared screen. And then, of course, our founder and CEO, Nora Herding, who's going to lead our session in a little bit.
Hey, everybody.
And looks like we're up to 19 participants. That's pretty good.
We'd love to hear where everybody's from. If you're coming in and you can find the chat window, share with us where you're joining us from.
We've got Adrian. Hi, Adrian. Hi, Brenna. Hi, Elsie. Erica's dialing in from Atlanta. Oh, one of our sales team is in Atlanta right now. Jen's in Lincoln, Nebraska. Gail's dialing in from Dallas. Lisa from New Jersey. Hi, Brenna from Ardmore, Oklahoma. Matt's in Brooklyn. Letty's in Cambridge. If you're just tuning in now, my name is Aaron Maper. I'm Director of Creative Development at ImageThink, and I'm co-hosting this webinar on designing and leading effective virtual brainstorms. We're going to wait just a few more minutes to let people join. I mentioned this when we first opened the webinar, but if you don't already have a pen and paper handy, grab yourself something to write with and something to write on. It could be a pen and paper. It could be a marker and a small animal, a mark making implement, and something to make marks on. We're going to have some interactive elements later in the session.
Aaron, are any animals injured in the filming of this webinar?
No, this is a completely animal-friendly webinar. And if you don't mind typing into the chat bar, we're curious to hear where everyone's dialing in from, and also any brainstorm challenges that you're facing. We're going to have some Q&A time at the end of the session where we're hoping to, have some conversations around how everyone is transitioning to the virtual brainstorm format and ways to solve for challenges. And we've got some more people joining. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Michelle. Hi, Paul. Adrian's in Boston. Welcome, Adrian.
Great. And also, we have, I think, an audience on Facebook, too. Isn't that right? So hello to everybody who's joining us live on Facebook.
Yeah, very cool. All right. Well, we're at, Jen's sharing a challenge, leading a group with a virtual brainstorm session when not everyone is tech savvy and using the virtual tools. That is a great note, and I think we'll definitely have time to talk about that later on. So we're at 2:03 now. What do you say? Should we get started?
Let's get this started.
Great. Well, thank you again, everyone, for dialing in. I'm going to introduce myself again. My name is Aaron Maper. I'm Director of Creative Development and a graphic recorder at ImageThink. And we're really excited to have you all dialing in and to share some tips on hosting and facilitating virtual brainstorms. So thanks everyone for joining. I said it a couple times, but if you're just dialing in, find yourself a pen and a piece of paper, something to write with and something to write on for some interactive elements later in the session. I'm joined by a few of my colleagues. Ariel Rothenberg is our senior graphic recorder, and you'll see on the shared screen that she's going to be listening and synthesizing the information from this session in real time and scribing it live. We've got Miles Mosley, our Director of Business Development. Sam Horvath, our Director of Marketing, who you've probably gotten some some great newsletters from. And if you've seen any of the great blog posts that have been up on our website lately, they're all thanks to him. And then, of course, our CEO and founder, Nora Herding, who's going to lead this session on elevating effective virtual brainstorms. Before we dive in, I just want to give a quick gloss on a few different types of ways to meet online. There are virtual conferences. So these are generally live streamed. They're oftentimes behind a paywall. So think of something like a TED Talk or a South by Southwest event, but on an online platform. Sometimes there's a digital dialogue box like Slack or Discord, or sometimes it's a chat that's built into the platform like we have here. If you haven't already found the chat and you're dialed into Zoom, find that, because we're going to ask you some questions throughout the event that we'd love to hear some answers from you all on. There are webinars. That's what we're in now. So these are also limited to a few presenters. They also might have a chat bar function. And then there are online meetings. And online meetings can and should model all the same good practices of highly collaborative, productive in-person meetings. So that's all to say that today we're going to have a webinar talking about some great insights into brainstorms for virtual meetings. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to ImageThink founder and CEO, Nora Herding.
Hi, thanks, Aaron. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm assuming that you all are familiar with ImageThink previously, but a little bit about us. We've been around since 2009, and we help clients elevate, engage, and bring great ideas to action. We do this in real life and virtually through agenda design and facilitation, graphic facilitation, which Ariel is going to show us in a minute, design thinking techniques, and visual storytelling. So during our 11 years in this space, we started to notice patterns emerge around client projects and the different kind of projects. So we developed this framework. It's called the ImageThink method. It's really like the life cycle of an idea. So the first is at the top, you see scan, and that's really around, you recognize that there's a challenge and you're gathering information. You might be research, it might be focus groups, it might be looking at the market, depending on the kind of problem you're facing. But that's where a lot of brainstorming happens, is in this phase. And then through that phase, you prioritize and choose an idea, and then you need to go out and kind of engage other people to get behind it. And you move through that into like your planning, mapping, milestoning, into the excite phase, and then finally into implement and reflect, and the whole cycle starts all over again. So just a little bit about that. We're going to be looking at brainstorming in the scan phase. Now, the way that this webinar came to be is really kind of interesting. For the last several years, I've been running workshops, at different places, Cannes, Lions last year. In February, the last one we did in real life was sort of a gift to clients of ours that were here in New York and can join us in person. And at the end of that session, someone raised their hand. The last question of the 2-hour workshop was, "This is awesome. What about if you have to run a brainstorm with a remote team?" And here we are kind of answering that. And I realized that there's a number of ways to modify and to address brainstorming in a virtual space. And so here we are now together for the next hour to do so. So it's such a huge topic. Today we're going to really focus on some fundamentals that I think are really important to keep in mind regardless of where your brainstorm happens, and then ways that you may want to modify to address some of these challenges that a few of you shared at the beginning. So here we go. The first thing is, let's take a look at kind of what we think of as the anatomy of brainstorm. And I think Ariel will put this up for us right now. These are kind of the steps that you want to take and the elements that you want to make sure you hit upon to have a successful outcome, right? So framing, communication, collaboration, creativity, and an action plan. So we're going to address each of these today and how you might modify these in a virtual space. But the first and most fundamental one really happens before you get folks together to discuss any kind of session. So oftentimes in sessions I've given around brainstorming, people will share that one of the problems is that they'll be given a mandate to think outside the box without really knowing how to get their teams and their people to do that. And the group might really want disruptive, innovative outcomes, but the ideas that end up coming out are sometimes predictable, uninspired, and frankly, sort of old. So if any of you out there can relate to this problem, you're in good company. I'm here to tell you that we help clients navigate this challenge all the time. And it's not you that has the problem, it's your problem that has the problem. It's because your frame is too narrow. Now, you might say, well, wait, what are you talking about, a frame? When we talk about brainstorming, it's like thinking out of the box. Well, I want you to really think about thinking out of the frame. So first, and I think Erin has some visuals here to illustrate this, is you have your problem, right? You have a challenge you can't answer. It's a question that's unresolved. And then next you have the box, right? Well, what is the box? The box is what's normal, what's obvious, what's known. And if you could solve the problem with the tools that you had inside the box, we wouldn't be talking about it, right? So far, this is pretty simple problem-solving concepts. But now I want you to think about the frame. And the frame is really your definition of what the problem is and your awareness of that. So the frame can be inside the box, it can be very narrow, or it can be very large and it can be outside of the box. And the notion of this frame is a design thinking concept. In design thinking, there is a lot of effort spent to uncover what is the real problem that needs to be solved. So a lot of upfront work in a design thinking approach to empathize with the users or whoever might be encountering it and really make sure you're solving that right problem. So I'm here to tell you, first of all, the biggest creative opportunity that you have in a brainstorming session of any kind isn't in the brainstorming session, it's beforehand and where you draw the frame. Often people will just be so focused on the solution that they'll jump into solving the wrong problem, and they haven't stepped back to really question what they're answering. So you might remember that at the beginning of our time dialing in, Erin asked everyone to have a writing implement and a piece of paper. And that's because I want to illustrate this with you right now. Are you game? What do you think, Erin? Do we have some willing participants out there in webinar land and joining us on Facebook?
I think it's a good group. Let's give it a go.
Great. So
yes.
The question is, and you're going to answer this question by making a quick sketch. And I think Erin is going to man the slides for this, is draw a picture of what a vase looks like, right? So a vase as in vase. What does a vase look like? And you're going to just answer that by making a quick sketch. Thank you, Sam, for putting that in the chat window. Now, this is a webinar, as Erin explained, so unfortunately we can't see you, because what we would do in a session that was a meeting, or if we were in real life, either way, is you would hold up your drawing, right? So we don't have the benefit of that in this format, but we have made a prediction. And I think Erin is ready to put up what we predicted you drew.
Yeah, I'm gonna take a wild guess and say it probably looks something like this.
Oh, Miles.
So
okay.
let's hear from folks. Does this vase look familiar? Did you draw something similar? And you can type your answer into the chat bar. Miles says kind of. Paul says yes. Lisa says yes. Joyce says
exactly.
Oh, exactly. Well, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So Erin, how do we do this? Are we like visual psychics?
Maybe.
Maybe. Well, the fact is in all of the sessions that we've given, where we've given this exercise in America and outside of America, the drawing almost always looks like this, because we made a very narrow frame for you, right? I asked you to draw what a vase looks like, and we gave you a very short amount of time. So now we're going to try experimenting with widening the frame. My next question for you, in which I'd like you to answer with a sketch, is Draw one way to enjoy flowers in your home. So you're going to now think about one way that you could enjoy flowers in the home. We'll give you a little bit more time because it's a wider frame. I like to enjoy flowers in my home when they're sent to me as a surprise. I don't know about you.
Hint, hint. Nudge, nudge, everybody.
If there's somebody special out there listening, I hope they're listening. Okay, so Aaron, what do we think? Do we give folks enough time?
Yeah, so I'm curious. Again, we can't see your drawings, but type into the chat bar. What are some ways that y'all came up with? How do you enjoy flowers in the home? Miles is going to use his as a bookmark. That's very sweet. Sam is going to send them to Nora. Lisa is going to put them in a vase on the table, floating in a big bowl, potpourri, planting them, decor on kitchen table, a wreath. So a much wider variety of responses than the first question.
Right, very much more heterogeneous, right? And that's because we widen the frame. So the good news is if you're feeling nervous, first off, about having a virtual brainstorming session versus an in real life one, is that the most fundamental part, so it's going to set us up for success, is work that you just do beforehand, right? So it will get you on the successful path if you can do well enough to widen the frame. So that might be great, Nora. You're like, great, frame makes sense. I drew a picture of a vase and a picture of pressed flowers, but what does this mean in the real world in business? So I'll tell you a story about one of our favorite engagements last year, working with a wonderful client. Her name is, let's just call her Brandy. And Brandy was promoted. She was taken on as a new position. And not only was her position new, but the whole division in which she was going to be running was brand new. So you might imagine that there wasn't a lot laid out for her in terms of instruction. So she decided she needed to have a meeting with her boss. And then the meeting turned into her boss and her boss's boss and her boss's boss. And a lot of important people were going to be there at the launch of her new job. So understandably, she was getting a little bit nervous. So she called on us to come and help her. And when we started talking to her about what was going to happen in this very short meeting, about an hour and a half with these very senior people, was that she had a PowerPoint matrix with a bunch of questions in there, some material for them to read, and she wanted them to fill out this matrix. And I started getting a little bit nervous because I thought, I'm not sure, this is going to happen in this short amount of time. So I asked her, you know what, think about the end of the meeting. What would you like at the end of the session? And she said, well, that's easy. I want to know what they want me to do. And I want to know the order in which they think I should do it. So really quickly, we reframed the whole ask, right? Instead of it being like, let's populate this set of documents, it became, the meeting is really about what does success look like according to these leaders for her and her division. And so with that, we totally reframed what the ask was in the complete approach. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we move on. But that is what framing is. So here we are. We talked about framing. The next component of the anatomy of a brainstorm is communication. And communication is important in a brainstorm, but always, all the time, right? Good communication really starts before your session starts. So before anybody logs into Zoom or WebEx or whatever it's going to be, you can set the stage. So good communication is going to be about sharing the frame, right, of what is the challenge that you have, your expectations, and also the agenda. So you want to tell people upfront what to expect. And one really simple thing, but fundamentally important, is to communicate to folks that you want them to participate. And that means being seen and being heard. So you're going to want to set the stage that people are going to have their videos on. And we spoke about this if you joined us in an earlier webinar around getting engagement just in virtual meetings in general, is to have your video on. So we talked about this before. We know that face-to-face interactions are the most effective thing for building trust and engagement. So let's use the tools that we have available to us and make sure we're approximating this as much as we can. And if you're shy or reticent about turning your video on, just remember that 2/3 of communication is nonverbal. So if you're having a session and you can't see someone else, you really are cutting down your ability to understand them, to read their cues. And if you have your video off, you're also basically curtailing your own ability to have impact. So keep your video camera on. Another element that we see people kind of forget about in a virtual space is just building in a time for check-in. And we also talked about this in our previous webinar. You know, there's always a little bit of transitional time when you meet in real life where people come in, they can look around the room, they see, oh, Sam's here, Aaron's here, they can have a few minutes to talk. When you have a virtual session, you need to just, you know, allocate some space for when people come in. You can see that when you all joined today, Aaron asked people to post in the chat, and we spent a little bit of time before we got started. So don't skip that, it's important. Another agenda item around great communication that really I advocate for in real life, or especially in a virtual setting, is to have some kind of rules of engagement. Now, this is great to do in any meeting, but it's especially important right now because we're all getting adjusted to working virtually. And we have, you know, tens of thousands of years of social norms around how we meet and communicate in person. So right now, you know, in a real life meeting, people aren't necessarily coming in and hiding their appearance or talking and not looking at the person or answering phone calls or making a sandwich or taking care of their child, letting the repairman in. But all of that's happening right now in video meetings around the world, right? And so setting some time up at the beginning to ask people how they want to meet and what kind of normative behaviors you want to have will help the group identify what those are. So one recommendation is to just put that over to the group. And that serves two purposes. One is it's less work for you because you don't have to come up with those rules are. But more importantly, if you ask the group to identify them, they will self-identify them and they will comply with them because they agreed upon them. So one prompt might just be to ask everybody at the beginning of a meeting to take a moment to reflect on a successful session that they've had virtually, and then to identify how did people behave. And together people will share that out, and then you'll have your set of engagement rules on how you're going to run your session. So really important to take that time to make these steps to communicate clearly at the beginning. All right, so here we are we talked about framing, we talked about communication, and now we're talking about collaboration. So we're setting us up for success because we have a good frame, we have good communication around how we want to work together. So there's so much to be said about ways to engender collaboration and a ton of research on it. But for today, we're going to just focus on some practical ways you can engender more collaboration virtually. What I'd like you to do is to just take a moment, and if you have that piece of paper still that Aaron had you grab, I'd like you to just write down what could be one advantage of having a virtual brainstorm. So what would be maybe one advantage to having a brainstorm virtually as opposed to meeting in real life to do so?
And if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to pop those into the chat bar too. Lisa
Yes.
says recording available people, recording is available to share afterwards. Matt says introverted people might be more comfortable sharing in a virtual format. Sam says time to think privately, not on stage. More people can come, less of a sense of pressure. More comfortable settings, maybe being in your own home makes people more comfortable and therefore more flexible in their thinking. So these are some great ideas. These are some great thoughts. Thank you for sharing these.
Great, thank you. So what we just did is we modeled our first point, our first tip, which is to build in reflection time. So, you know, we have this conception of brainstorming that it's highly collaborative and it's all about extroverts throwing out ideas, but that's not necessarily the case. by structuring some prompts that serve both introverts and extroverts. You'll provide variation, and that will help prompt the group in large to have better thinking. So in this case, first I asked you to think about a time, or think about a benefit of virtual brainstorm. Asked you to write it down. So that's a low-tech way, first of all, for someone to engage. And then once everyone has some time to do that, it will happen very fast because we only have a short time together. But once everyone had time to do that, then Erin asked everyone to post in the chat. So that allowed people to really think, gather their thoughts, and then share. So that brings us to group dialogue and sharing. So using the chat function can be really helpful, like we just saw. You can ask people to reflect, you can ask people to share their contributions, you can have one person man the chat like Erin's been doing to sort of read out what people are posting. So it's a great tool as sort of a virtual whiteboard or reflection place to have people first reflect and then share. And then you could even go into a second round where we could all read everybody's contributions in the chat and then reflect upon that. So once you do that, then you can move into a round of sharing. And we like to really think about, when we're leading a session that's very dialogue based, like a brainstorming session, how to have variation, right? So you have some things that are more self-reflective. You might have some that you're in pairs, so you're in discussion groups. You might have larger groups, and then of course your group with large. So one way to do this is to use breakout rooms, which is not impossible. There are a number of platforms that will allow you to experiment and use virtual breakout rooms, Zoom being one of those. So as you're planning your session, it's important to think about what platform you're using and what it'll enable. The nice thing about using a breakout room is that you have a lot of control over it. So you basically set who goes into that room, and then automatically they're transported there. And you can send them notes about timing. And when it's time to come back together, people are sort of teleported back into the main session, right? So you don't quite have to run into that managing that liminal time where you're trying to bring people back together. One tip is to just make sure that you've had a little bit more time, as there's a sort of transition that happens between being in a group and then going into the breakout room. So lots of benefits there. If the technology you're using doesn't allow that, we were recently facilitating a session where that was the case. So a number of different breakout rooms were set up with links in advance in the agenda. Then the groups could go into those meetings, have their smaller group conversation, and then join another meeting link to come back into the sort of plenary session. So breakout rooms are a possibility. The next point is to consider high-tech and low-tech tools for sharing. And this was something that someone shared in the chat, right? Is how do you manage when you have different folks with different levels of comfort with technology? So if for the right group, there's a lot of online collaboration tools you may be familiar with, like Mural or Miro. We recently did a session using Google Jamboard. And these can be really powerful for a few reasons. First off, they're visual, which is important to us, and we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And they also allow for parallel processing, which means multiple people can be typing or adding notes into them, which can be more collaborative and efficient. But on the other hand, they're also a separate piece of technology that you're having to get familiar with, and your group also. So it is an investment time and a cognitive load. Sometimes an approach is to give everyone sort of pre-session homework where they have to go into that tool and do a little activity. And that's really just designed to get people a little familiar with the tool before you actually have your brainstorming session as it is. So there are a number of online courses and tutorials around how to use those particular tools, and you can experiment with them and see if it's right for your particular group and the team. But on the other hand, also don't be afraid to go lo-fi with sticky notes. So You all were encouraged to just write on a piece of paper. You could see that Miles and Sam held theirs up in front of the camera. And varying it can be really helpful. So people who maybe find the technology a little bit more of a barrier feel like they have a moment where that's removed and you can simply do something low tech, and that's perfectly fine. Works great with the right group. So think about lo-fi and hi-fi technology as an option. Now, speaking of low tech and high tech, we're going to talk about visuals. And you can see we have Ariel here creating a live visual for me as we're talking. And now you might be worried that you're not necessarily artists, you don't have somebody with Ariel's proficiency. But if we think back about my story around Brandy, is you can create a visual framework. So if you remember, we were going to help her get a sense of what was success for her new position. And we created a visual framework that first had a metaphor of the current state. So asking people, what does that current state look like? Where are we now? And then a visual spot for the future. And we basically made a bridge as a tool. And visuals, can be an incredible accelerant for all elements of brainstorming. So first of all, communication. It can really help remove barriers of communication between different working groups if you have someone documenting visually. It can cut through the jargon, it can cut through different cultures, and it helps a group if you have different native tongues as well. So in the example with Brandy, having a visual of this bridge really quickly simplified things and made it easy to communicate around what the real ask of the session was for her. Using visuals in a brainstorm is also effective for equalizing voices. I bet that a lot of you on this webinar have had the challenge of how you manage a group where you have some people that are much more vocal, and you might have people that either because they're introverts or because of politics or hierarchy don't speak out as much. What's great about having a visual recorder is that it is a great equalizer of everyone's ideas, because every concept or insight is recorded one time. And if you find someone keeps repeating themselves, you can gently point out that their comment has been copied and recorded. And so the end result is a true reflection of the diversity of input in the group, regardless of how loud or quiet they are. Also, something else that we love around visuals is that it helps create themes and structure. So an expert graphic facilitator like Ariel is going to be able to create structure out of the natural chaos of a brainstorm. So by grouping similar ideas and concepts together, the group at the end can really see what themes have emerged together. And it builds a shared vision of the future, which is really most important to help create a plan to action. So in our example with Brandy, she left at the end of the session with a visual that not only made it clear to her what the definition of success looked like for the leaders that she was working with, but she now had a communication piece to go back to her team and show them a vision of what they were working towards, which is really powerful. And that gets us to the last benefit, which it creates a map to action. So creating a map to action is so important in being able to take all the ideas that you had in the brainstorm and move them forward into the next phase. It serves as a document to everybody in the group, but also as a powerful tool for the people who weren't there. So we've talked so far about framing, communication, collaboration, visuals, and how they're an accelerant to create a planned action. So we saved creativity for the last part because we have an exercise for you. So oftentimes, just in the same idea where people feel challenged to immediately think outside the box, when people are asked to think of big, groundbreaking ideas, it's understandable that they might freeze up. And that's because they're really trying to think about the right answer. So the best way to approach this is to have everyone start with a low stakes activity, something that is lighthearted, that's not related to the original problem, but that can start to build what's called creative confidence to get people to think a little bit different about that frame and the way they approach it. So we'd like to actually, instead of us telling you how well it works, but we'd love to share a technique that we have that you're welcome to try now and take with you into your next session. Are you all game? What do you think, Erin? Are folks game?
Let's do it.
Okay, I just had to have a sip of water there. Okay, great. So this is what we're gonna do, is I want you to look around the room and set your sights on an object that is preferably at least 5 feet away from you. When you're gonna go in a second, and you're gonna walk there and you're gonna pick it up, and then you're gonna come back to your computer. But on the way back, we want you to walk backwards instead of forwards. All right, so the first thing is you're going to look and identify an object in your space that's 5 feet away. You're gonna walk and pick it up, and then on the way back, you're gonna walk backwards. All right, are we ready? Erin, are we ready?
Ready?
Yep,
Set,
okay, set, go.
And as you're walking backwards, make sure to chart yourself a clear path.
It's really just to confuse your small child or your cat.
Bonus points if you can moonwalk while you're doing it. Great, it looks like Miles is back, Sam's back. How are we doing? Are people back at their seats?
Great, so before we ask you to share, okay, all right, Lisa's back. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Jen. All right, so why did we ask you to do that? What on earth? Well, for a few reasons. One is it got you to shift your awareness away from this session to something else. And it got you up and moving. And there's a lot of research. One of my favorite neuroscience writers named Wendy Suzuki has done a ton of research around the cognitive benefits of exercise. We know that it gets the blood flowing and more oxygen to your brain, and particularly your prefrontal cortex. So that primes you to think differently. And then walking backwards, well, we asked you to do something very familiar in a novel way. So it starts to get you to use different neural pathways than you do when you're doing something habitually. So now you're primed up to be creative and feel a little bit more creative. So the next component of this is, I think Erin's gonna ask us to share our object, is that right?
Yeah, so you all have your objects. Type into that chat bar, what did you bring back to your seats? Matt's got a water bottle. Someone has a clamp. Miles has a clamp. Lisa has a tube of lotion. Valentina's got a book. Sam's got his trusty yo-yo. A kid's backpack from Adrian. Ooh, a bobblehead of baby
beach painting.
Wow.
Okay, so now the next part is we are going to choose one of those objects. Erin, have you set sight on one of the objects that you want to choose?
Yeah. Oh, I'm going to choose Katie's xylophone mallet.
Wow. Okay. So everyone picture, we don't have the benefit of seeing this amazing mallet, but picture the mallet. And now what I want you to do is to use that piece of paper that you have. I want you to write down as many uses to that mallet. How did you put it, Erin, that are not recommended by the manufacturer?
That's right.
Okay, so alternative uses that what is other than intended by the manufacturer. So other than to make a noise with a xylophone, what are as many different ways you can think to use that?
And this is a question that we actually have in our interview process.
Yes, it's not a xylophone mallet, but yeah. It is the final and required question if you're interviewing at ImageThink.
So Sam's going to use them to build a small fence. A xylophone mallet, just so everyone's clear, in case there's people with different, if English isn't your first language, or essentially a drumstick, like to beat on a drum, same thing. So to break a glass, From Lisa, I could think of using it as like a prop for a lollipop or something if you're doing a play.
Okay. So as you're writing these down, once you have a few down, we're going to share, right, Aaron?
Yeah, so once you have a few thoughts, pop it into the chat bar. I see a few people have already started sharing some thoughts. Grant says to use it as a judge's gavel. Joy's going to use it as a cocktail stirrer. I like that idea. Yeah, Joy's got the right idea. To stir a pot. All right, we've got some cooking on the mind. A lot of people doing that making some good food. A weapon if attacked by a hamster.
Over on Facebook, Christine would use it to play fetch with her dog.
He'd like that pretend microphone. If a giant knocks at your door and has something stuck in his teeth and you don't want to make it awkward, you could give it to him as a toothpick.
That's good. Got it as a paint stirrer, to conduct an orchestra. Pretend magic wand.
Oh, kindling. Great. All right. Well, thank you everybody for playing along. A window prop. Great. And as we're talking, I know you're going to have more ideas. That's always what happens. So this is just an exercise to show a few things, a way to create an entry point for people to exercise their creativity when they might not particularly feel empowered to do so. We set it up in a couple of ways, right? So we got you looking at your space differently. We got you up and moving. We asked you to do something ordinary in an unordinary way. And then we took a common object and we're finding alternative uses for it. So we're widening that frame again from what was beyond what it was intended for to something else. So thank you so much for doing that. Creativity is such an important component in the brainstorming process that, you know, in our outline, we have it last, but of course it's coming at entry points throughout, starting with really how we approach the problem, how we frame it up, and setting up all those elements. So we talked about framing, we talked about some ways to facilitate communication. At the beginning, prior to the session and at the beginning of the session, there's really important notes to hit on around communicating. We talked about some different ways to orchestrate collaborating and sharing. We talked about how powerful visuals can be to accelerate this whole process. And then finally, we all got a little creative together. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Aaron and Sam, and then I believe we may have a little bit of time for Q&A for anyone who wants to post those questions also.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Nora, for these great insights into designing more creative virtual brainstorms. Let's all give Ariel a big round of applause. She was listening and scribing all of this live in real time. Really beautiful output. And thank you all for joining. We really enjoyed spending some time with you all. If you enjoyed this webinar, please connect with us on LinkedIn. We would really love to hear from you, or connect with us at imagethink.net/contact. I just dropped those links into the chat bar. And if you have an upcoming team meeting where you need help designing a brainstorm or leading collaboration, that's our sweet spot. So we're here to help you widen the frame, set the stage, graphic record, and even facilitate if that'll be useful. With that, I think that let's see if anyone has any challenges, some brainstorm challenges that they're facing that they want to bat some thoughts around on. Share those with us in the chat bar. We have a few minutes. And we did have one shared with us towards the beginning of the session from Jen, whose challenge was leading a group through a virtual brainstorm session when not everyone is tech savvy and using virtual tools. So people are coming to a Zoom meeting with maybe different familiarity, different technical know-how. Nora or Sam, do you have any thoughts on sort of how to get people on the same page, or how to make the best use of everyone's time when maybe technical levels are at different places?
Yeah, so I mean, this is something that is lots of folks are encountering. One would be to go as low tech as possible. Again, we talked about something simple like using Post-it notes, having people write and draw themselves and then share those ideas out. Another option is to consider creating some kind of pre-work or pre-session where people, you have folks log in and do a pre-session where you can orient them to the technology, or you give them a task, and the secret objective of that task is to really get them to familiarize themselves with the technology, which is another approach. So those are two ways that we see as effective as, go low tech, or, or invest some time with some alternative sessions and activities prior.
And I would just add to that to say that another thing we found is really assigning clear roles, which I think we spoke to earlier. But you'll notice that on this session, a lot of the ImageThink team has played different roles, monitoring the chat. Aaron's been helping to MC. We have Ariel scribing. And so by really giving people clear, roles and purposes, it helps to demystify the tech, and no one's responsible for all of it at once, which is really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Thanks, Nora. That was a great question. A great challenge. Oh, sorry, Miles.
Yeah, just to jump in, one thing we've been seeing a lot of is care packages. So actually physically sending care packages ahead of sessions, ahead of important meetings. And that can include instructions on kind of where to be and when, and how to use things like Zoom. So you can teach people how to meet you online, and kind of send them things ahead of time to prep and prepare. And I would say to Lisa Morton as well, the challenge around leading virtual brainstorms that include blind people, the care packages can alleviate some of that as well, in that you can send materials that can be taken by attendees ahead of time to prepare them for the activities ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
That is a really interesting challenge. I guess I'm assuming that the whole group is not visually impaired, but that there's one person that's visually impaired, which you could take the track where then you don't use visuals at all, so that you set the stage and you level set the stage. You could also use the visuals and then build in time for people to reflect and describe what's been recorded, which can be helpful for the entire group, actually, to slow down and kind of verbally say what they see and what's been said and what's been recapped is another approach. It reminds me also of a question that came the last time we did this session, which was like, someone was considering having a hybrid session where a few people were in the room together and the other people were remote. And we actually advocated to make the whole session remote then, so that you have just a level playing field with everyone. And that might be something to consider for the folks that are talking about, where there's lots of different abilities that are coming up, right? Like different technological proficiencies is one, visual, being sighted or visually impaired is another. And so perhaps making the decision that you level set to where everyone in the group can participate. I'm curious Tammy said that she feels that her team struggles with brainstorming in general. And I don't know, Tammy, if you want to share a little bit more about what part do you feel that the group gets stuck on? Because there's different components. So a lot of it can be cultural or just barriers people have around what they think a brainstorming session should be like. So perhaps working on how it's framed up, that might be where the challenge is, or I'm wondering if it's a little bit more around the communication and collaboration part. So if you're still on and you want to share more, happy to take a look at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And while you're thinking on that, let's look at another question as well. So Katie asks if there's any advice, do's or don'ts, for leading an ideation with people in different time zones, or, and I think this is more important, from different cultural backgrounds. I think that's something that we talk about quite frequently at ImageThink, ways to use graphic recording and graphic facilitation as a bridge between different cultures. I'm thinking of one instance in particular where we were working with a company that was merging different offices from Japan and the US. They're very different work cultures, very different ways of approaching problems, and using visuals to sort of align on some common rules of engagement. Nora or Miles, do you have any thoughts on that? And then it looks like Tammy has some follow-up from her question.
Miles, it sounds like you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I think
Miles has his video on, so I can tell that he's really excited about answering this.
The hand raise,
Yeah.
No, that's great. And I think, one thing to remember is that these are meetings, right? Just because they're virtual doesn't mean that they're any different. I mean, they are quite different, but you still want to be respectful of cultures. And when you travel to another place in our meeting, there's best practices. But I think, so keep that in mind, right? Because we now don't have geographical barriers and everyone may be meeting from different cultures. You want to be present to that. And I think, to Aaron's point, setting kind of common rules and framework is a great way to do that together.
Great, thanks, Miles. Yeah, I think just laying out on the table maybe at the outset what different expectations are going into a meeting, what different needs are, and also just having some honest discussions about sort of the different ways that you work across different different cultures might work, or different offices might work. I think is an important first step. And Tammy, thanks for sharing some more thoughts. So it sounds like the work, your team is really just wanting to get back to the work, and they're stuck in the details. They're not that creative with ideas. I would say one thought I have, and then I'd love to hear the rest of our team's thoughts. But I don't think it's an uncommon challenge to get people to buy into the need to have a brainstorm. We're all booked on a lot of meetings every day, especially now. Your day is probably one Zoom call to the next, and I think that in order to sort of get people to buy into focus during a meeting and to open up during a brainstorm, showing why, showing that it's just as much of a piece of the work as as the rest of the day-to-day tasks are, and showing how it's going to be carried through into the work the following day. Nora, Miles, Sam, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, there's a lot there. It's a good problem in some ways to have, but one might be just in framing up, as Aaron said, the expectation that, and it doesn't have to be a long time. It can be 15 or 20 minutes. Like for the next 15 or 20 minutes, we're generating ideas. We also talk in other sessions around brainstorming around this idea of yes and, which is something that's borrowed from improv. But there's activities around that, which is you just build on someone's idea instead of saying no. Another way to approach it is to maybe take it just so left field that they can't get stuck in the details because it's not realistic. Where you're like, let's brainstorm the worst ideas for this problem first. I mean, it sounds silly. Or, you give them a brainstorm that is so, you frame it up so broadly, like, let's say, if we had all the money in the world, how would we solve this problem? Or, or if you bring it down really small and say, okay, we have to solve this problem, with no resources. So you first give them some exercises that are so sort of left field that it keeps them from kind of moving into that detail mode. Could be another sort of fun way to experiment with it. And then again, have them practice. So just give them prompts, 5-10 minutes when you're together, kind of like what we did today, to just get them to see how they're thinking when the stakes are really low and it's not related to their day-to-day work.
Yeah, I think just to echo, partially echo, but an important thing, I think a lot of creative individuals, even outside of our fields, creative writers, performers, artists will tell you that one of the important parts of the creative process is to separate it from the sort of editing process. And that, if you're writing something, writing is about getting everything out, getting it good, bad, and ugly on paper, not worrying about the details, not being finicky about perfection. And then the editing process is where you go in and sort the details. So, that could be helpful of really, reminding people, hey, this is, as part of the brainstorm, this is like we're writing something from scratch, or we're painting a new painting. This isn't about getting it perfect. And then we also talked about how with graphic recording as sort of a great equalizer, if you do have someone who is, scribing or graphic recording, or if they're just taking notes in a traditional fashion on a laptop, empowering that person to speak up and note whenever, hey, I have that idea down, let's move on, and really, giving someone the power to facilitate and move the conversation forward if an idea has been captured, so that you don't get bogged down in one thing.
Yeah, to build on that, Sam, I just posted in the chat a great book, very easy read. I hope I got his name correct in the spelling. Edward de Bono, 6 Thinking Hats. It's also a great framework for brainstorming, because each hat you have a different role. So one hat is the optimist, where you think everything is going to be positive. Another hat is the black hat, is like the critical hat, and each hat has a role. So you could potentially give everyone a different hat, or say, we're all putting on the white hat right now, so we're going to embrace every single idea. A long time ago, I was an art professor, and I wish I had read this book then, because I used to have trouble getting people to really be critical when they talked about other people's art. And I feel like this would be a great use in that setting, because you kind of force people to say, I'm wearing this hat, and this is, and you take it, it's no longer personal, because you have that as a device. So I think there's a lot there, and that could be helpful to you all. So.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Nora. Thanks, Sam.
Great.
Well, that was, I think we had some really great conversation there, some really valuable thoughts, and we're coming up on time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us and sticking with us through the hour. Again, sharing in the chat bar our LinkedIn page and our contact page on our website. So if you have any upcoming meetings that you need support with, any brainstorms that you need help elevating, please get in touch. We'd love to work with you on them. And if you joined late, if you missed the first half of this, if you missed the first 5 minutes, keep an eye on your inbox, because we're going to be sharing some follow-up assets. It'll include Ariel's beautiful graphic recording, as well as some other key takeaways. And I believe this video is actually going to be shared on our Facebook account, because it's sharing live there, right, Sam?
It should live on Facebook. Yes, we've
oh my
live, so,
wow.
So
look,
we're all internet famous, and
we
Thanks,
made
Lisa.
it to the internet. So
yeah. And thank you to everybody who participated and shared questions and challenges in the chat. I think the whole group is better for it, and that for those of you who didn't, that might bolster your confidence to see that a lot of these problems are common problems, but they have solutions. And remember, we're all learning right now. There's a lot of developmental edge happening and growth happening as people come on and adapt to this new way of working. So those technology challenges folks are having, the engagement challenges, be patient with yourself and other people. And remember, we're here if you need us. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.